Yeah. Hello everyone. Is my voice audible, guys?
Yes, audible.
So in last session we have seen right how to share the data from parent component to child component. How to share the data from parent component to child component using props. Using props we have seen. Have you guys tried that task which I have given?
Yes,
So I told that create A component, B component, C component, D component, and E component. And share the data from A component to A component to E component. So basically what we have to do, we have to share the data from A component to B component using props, then B component to C component, then C component to D component, and then D component to E component, right? So let me just go back to my VS Code in my under SRC, under components, under parent child. Already we have ABC. Let me just create two more files here, e.jsx and e.jsx. Let me create the component. So here we have a D component, and here we have the E component. E component. Let's assume that here I'm just taking H3 and I'm saying here data. Some data we need to display here. Now this D component I should render inside the C component. So here I will import D component, and somewhere here I will render the D component. So right now I will remove this H4 from here, and I will remove this break as well. Here I will directly render D component. And inside D component, we have to import E component. And here we have to render E component. Now we get that relationship A, B, C, D, E. So just for differentiating these components, what I will do here is I will add HR tag. So one line you will get here. Let me just check how it is getting. So here like this one line we got. And here also I will add that HR. So if I go back here, I got it. So we have A component, B component, C component, D component, and E component. Now I want to share the data from A to E. A to E. Same thing we can do with this A, B, and C also. I will just remove these styles. And here simply I will add that HR tag. Same thing I will do with the B as well. We'll just remove these styles. Here I will simply add HR tag. So we got something like this: A, B, C, D, and E component. So now the moment I click on this button, I want to share the data to with the E component. If I click on this, that data should be shared with the E component. So what we need to do? In the A component, whenever you click on this button, whenever we click on this button, we are calling this function. Inside this function, we are calling setState. And inside the setState, we are passing some data. That data will go and store inside your state. That data will go and store inside your state. And this state, we are passing to B component as a props. So as a props, we are passing that state data to the B component. Now B component will receive as a props. Again, this props we are passing to the C component. Now C component will also receive the props. Now again, this props we have to pass to the D component. Now you decide whatever key you want. Okay, I am just taking here something like data equals to info. Like this, if you take different keys, see here you are taking data, and in B you are taking info. In A, again you are taking info. So if you try to take like this different keys, then there might be confusion for you. Or in future, you might get confused completely, like exactly what is this info, what is this data. That is the reason for maintaining or like for keeping things simple. What we will do, we will follow same key for each and every component. So whenever we are passing props, we will try to maintain same key. So here, if I am taking info, in B also I will take info, and inside the C also I will take info. It's not mandatory that you should have same key. If you want, you can give different keys also. But if you give different keys, then there are a lot of chances that in future you might get confused. That's why better to maintain the same kind of pattern. Now we are giving this info to D component as a props. So go to the D component. Again, here you can destructure your props. Again, this info you give to the E component. Now E component receives same data as a props. Again, here you can destructure it, info. And now you can pass your info here. Now if you go back, here you got the query. The moment I refresh, there is nothing, no data inside your E component. But the moment I click on this button, I will get here query. So basically you are passing the data from A component to E component, but you cannot pass the data directly. You have to pass that data in a chain, like from A to B, B to C, C to D, D to E. And this process of passing the data from parent component to child component to subchild to subchild to subchild, this process of passing the data from A to B, B to C, C to D, D to E is called props drilling. This process is called props drilling. It's a props drilling. What is props drilling? Props drilling is the process of passing the data from uppermost component to the lowermost component. Props drilling is the process of passing the data using props from uppermost component to the lowermost component. But what is the problem with this props drilling means? The first problem what we are going to encounter is things will become complex. Things will become complex as more components are nested. Right now, we have only 5 or 6 components which are nested. But let's assume that you have 15, 20, or 30 components which are nested for. In that case, passing the data from uppermost to the lowermost component will be very complex. Slowly, things will become complex. That is the first problem what we are going to face. Second problem, if any component fails to receive the data, if any components fails to receive the data, then destin destination component will never receive the data. Suppose due to some reason, if any component fails to receive the data, let's assume that you are trying to share the data from A to E. Due to some reason, C component fails to receive the data. So whenever this chain breaks, then this destination component will never receive the data. This destination component will never receive the data. So you have to take care of each and every component, that properly the data is passed to each and every component. So there is a risk factor here. What is that risk factor? Due to some reason, if any component fails to receive the data, any middle component fails to receive the data, then destination component will never receive the data. That is the second problem what we are going to face if you go with the props tree. Third, if intermediate components doesn't or does not require the data, then if intermediate component does not require the data, then we should not make data available to them. Right now, our target was to share the data with E component, but we cannot share the data directly from A component to E component. That is not possible. That is the reason what we are doing. We are sharing the data from A to B, B to C, C to D, D to E. Now here B, C, D, they don't require the data, but still the data is available to them. Now why the data is available to them? Because we have to create that chain. So here unnecessarily we are making data available to B component, C component and D component. Actually, they don't require the data, but to create this chain, we are forcing them to get the data and pass to its child. So if certain component doesn't require the data, then we should not make that data available to them. But here in the props drilling, we are making that data available to them. So now the data what we are passing from A to E is available to B also, it is available to C also, it is available to D also. So these are the problems what we are going to face if we go with the props drilling. Props drilling. First, your things will become complex in future. To manage your application might become little bit complex, or in future you might get completely confused if you are sharing the data using props. If any intermediate component fails to receive the data, then destination component will never receive the data. That is the second problem. Third problem, if intermediate component doesn't requires any kind of data, then we should not make data available to them. But because of props drilling, all the intermediate component will have that data which we are sharing to the some specific component. So these are the three problems what we are going to encounter if you go with the props drilling. Props drilling. So when we should go with the props concept to share the data means if you want to share the data from within one level or two level. Like if you have one level like from A to B only if you want to share, then better to go with props, or maximum two level. Like if you want to share the data from A to C, then you can prefer props. If you want to share the data at level 1 or at level 2, then better to go with props. If you want to share the data at different levels, like maybe at level 3 or level 4 or level 10 or level 15, then props concept is not recommended. Props concept is not recommended. Why it is not recommended? Because these are the issues what we are going to face. Then how to share the data? This is where another concept came into picture, that is context API. So if you want to share the data from parent to child at different levels, which is more than 2 or more than 3, in that case, better to go with your context concept. So what is this context concept means? It's very simple. Suppose if your components are nested in this way, you have A component child is B component child is C component child is D component child is E component. If your components are nested like this and you want to share the data from A component to E component, in that case, what React suggests is create a context. Create something called context. Context is nothing but it's like a space. You are creating some space. Create a context. Now, parent component has the data. So what this parent component will do, it will simply store that data inside this space. Whatever data parent component has, parent component will simply store that data inside this context. Child component will receive that data or it will access that data from the context. That's it. He wants the data, he will access the data. If suppose C also wants the data, C also can access this data. Any child component can access the data from the context. No need to share the data from parent to child to child to child. Simply parent has the data, so parent will store that data inside the context. Child wants the data, so they will access that data from the context. So here, first you have to learn how to create context, how to store the data in the context, and how to access the data from the context. You have to understand 3 points. What are those 3 points? How to create context, how to share the data, and how to store the data in the context. Third, how to access the data from the context. How to access the data from the context. If you understand these 3 points, then you will be able to implement context API in your application. Very, very simple. How to create context, how to store the data in the context, how to access the data from the context. So context concept came to overcome the problem of props drilling. To overcome the problem of props drilling. Context is suitable only for sharing the data from parent component to the child component. Context concept is suitable for sharing the data from parent component to child component at any level. Remember, from parent to child only. For vice versa, you can use props and you can use context also, but they are not recommended. If you want to share the data from child to parent, then context API and props concepts are not recommended. They are just not recommended. If you want, you can share, but it is not recommended. So 90% we use context API just to share the data from parent component to child component at any level. It can be at any level. It can be at any nested component. Understood the concept of context API? Anyone have any doubts in this? So what is context API concept? Context API is a simple technique to share data from parent component to child component. Yeah, let me know on the chat whether you understood or not. If you understood, type 1. If you did not understand, type 0. You should understand what is context API and why we are going for context API. Okay. So the problem statement is we wanted to share the data from uppermost parent component to lowermost child component. So there are two ways to share the data. One way is props. So in props, what you have to do, you have to share the data to each and every component in that tree. So if you go with that approach, there are some problems. And sharing the data from A to B, B to C, C to D in this nested fashion, this process we call as a props drilling. There are some problem with the props drilling. To overcome this problem, context API concept came into picture. Now what context API says, you just create some space. First you create a space. Once the space is created, parent component will store that data inside that space. Once the data got stored inside that space, once the data is available in the context, any child component can access the data from that context. Any child component can access the data from that context. Very simple and very easy. Okay, now this was completely theoretical part. Now let's try to understand practically how to implement context. So what I will do, first let's go with some basic example. So all these things we are going to implement in our project, guys. Okay. So here, everything you have to learn the concept. And once we start our project, there we will be using all these concepts. I'm using here context. I'm just creating a subfolder called context API. In that, again, I will create same a.jsx, b.jsx, c.jsx, d.jsx. And here I will create e.jsx. In a.jsx, I'm creating this component. Here simply I will add h2. I will say a component. Let me add some style here. Some padding. 50 pixel. Let me add here break statement. And let me, yeah, right now let me add here one button. Submit or something. I will just copy this part. I will paste here. And here instead of A, we required B component. Here instead of A, we require C component. We don't require button here. We don't require button here. Here also B component. Here also B component. Okay, here I will add H4. I will say data. For this style color, I will add here green. Now here I will import B component, and that B component I will render here. Here I will import C component. And here simply I will render C component. Import D component. Here I will render D component. Import E component. Here simply render E component. Go to your app.js. Here I will import A component from components under that context API under that A. Now if you save it, you got here like this. Okay, just very simple design. A component, we have B component, we have C component, we have D component, we have E component. Now my requirement is the moment I click on this button, I want to share the data with the E component. But this time I don't want to go with the props concept. Okay. So what we are going to do? We have created our component structure like this. We have A component, we have B component, we have C component, we have D component, and finally we have here E component. We have E component. Now I want to share the data from A component to this E component. Okay, this is your A component and this is your E component. Here I want to share the data. So for this, first of all, we have created this kind of structure. Now, second step, what we have to do is we have to create one context here. We have to create a context. We have to create one simple context. Now, how to create a context? To create this context, React is providing us one predefined function called create a context. So create context is a predefined function which is coming from React library. If you call this function, it will create one context and it will return you the reference of that context. reference of the context. It will return the reference of the context. So the first step what we have to do here is create the context. How to create the context? For that, simply inside this context hyphen API folder, create one separate file, context.js. Okay, I am creating JavaScript file here. In this file, import create context function from React library. From React library, we have to import create context function. Now simply call this function create context. Whenever you call this function, internally one context will be created and the reference of that context will be written. If it is returning the reference of the context, just hold in one variable. I will say that my first context. That's it. This is how we create the context. After creating the context, export that context from this file, because this context we required in some other files also. That's why we are exporting this context from this file. Import the create context function, call that create context. It will create a context for you and it will return you the reference. Now using this reference, we can access that context and export that context. That's it. This is what you have to do. This is our first step. We have created the context. Second step, now second step, what we have to do, we have to store some data inside this context. A context is created here. After creating context from our parent component, from this parent component, you have to store the data inside your context. So to store the data inside your context, this context is providing us one predefined component called provider. Okay, whatever context you have created. My first context. This context provides us one predefined component called provider. Using this provider component, we can store the data. We can store the data inside the context. Inside the context. So using this provider component, we can store the data inside the context. This provider component takes one props. It takes one props called value. And to this value props, we have to provide our data as a value. We have to provide our data as a value. So remember, this is a component. It's a predefined component. It's a provider component. This provider component takes one props and the name of that props, the key of that props is value. To this props, we have to provide our data as a value. So if you provide your data as a value to this provider component, then internally provider component will store your data inside the context. It will store your data inside the context. So how to access this provider component? To access this provider component, simply you have to use your context. You have to say my first context dot provider. So basically you have to render provider component. And it is like a opening tag and closing tag. My first context dot provider. So for this, what you have to do now, you have to go to your parent component. You have to go to your parent component. In our case, A is a parent component. Here, First you import your context. First you import your context. Second, you just render provider component. How to render provider component? For that, you have to use your context name dot, you have to say provider. Now we are rendering the provider component. Now this provider component takes one props, and that props is value. The key name of that props is value. Remember, we have to take value only. Why we have to take value only? Because this is a predefined component. This component is not created by us. It is already created by React people. And they told that this component takes one props and the key of that props is value. Now, to this value props, whatever data you will provide here. For example, if I am passing here number like 100. If I am passing 100, this 100 will go and store inside this context. This 100 will go and store inside this context. If you want, you can store one string also. Like this, I can store one string also. If I store a string, then this string will go and store inside this context. Now, who will store this string in the context? Internally, provider component will do that for us. Internally, provider component will do that for us. You can store any type of data in the context. You can store number, you can store string, or I can store like this one array also. Like this array also I can store. In this array, I can have any type of data. I can have number, I can have string, I can have object, I can have one function, I can have one sub array. Like this, I can store any type of data. In the same way, if you want, you can store one object also. Like this one object also you can store. So you can pass anything as a value. Number, string, object, array, function, whatever you want, you can store. So this is our first example. So directly I want to store some number here. So I'm passing here 100. Okay, I'm hard coding my data here. I'm just passing here 100. Now what happens? This 100 will go and store inside this context. So second step, what we have to do here is render provider component inside the parent component and pass the data to the provider component as a props, as a value props. What we have to do? We have to render provider component. Rendering is nothing but calling. We have to call provider component inside the parent component and pass the data, whatever data you want to store in the context. That data you have to pass to the provider component as a value props, as a value props. So for this, what you have to do? First, you have to import your context. You have to import your context. After importing the context, you have to render your provider component. You have to render the provider component. And then you have to pass the value props to the provider component, and to that value props, you have to pass your data. You have to pass your data. This is the second step what we have to do. Third step, make context available to all the children or all the child components of parent component by wrapping direct child inside the provider component. Now, if all the child component wants to access the data of this context, then what this child component has to do? Suppose you want to make the data of context available to all the childrens, then what we have to do means we have to wrap our all the child components inside the provider component. We have to wrap all our child components inside the provider component. So if you wrap all your child components inside the provider component, then all the child component can access the data of the context. When a child component can access the data of the context means if they are wrapped inside the provider component. So here what I need to do, now this is my provider component which I am rendering in A component. Now simply this B component, you have to wrap inside this provider component. Nothing but you have to render that B component inside the provider component. This is called wrapping. This is wrap. Now, this B component can access the data of this context. Not only B, B's child component also can access the data of context. Child's child can access, child's child can access. So all the direct and indirect child of B component, all the direct and indirect child of B component can access the data from the context now. Can access the data from the context now. All the child, all the direct and indirect child of B component can access the data from this context now, including B component. So this is the third step what we have to do. Fourth step, access the data from the context. Access the data from the context. Using use context hook. Using use context hook. Now here we are going to encounter with one more hook that is called use context. Use context is a hook which will help us to access the data from the context. It will give us access of data from the context. So using use context, we can access the data from the context. So now I want to access the data in my E component. So go to your E component. Here, first you import use context hook from React library. You import your context also here. Now this use context, you can call inside your component. Just call this use context. Now, what is the use of this use context? It will give you the data of the context. But which context? I want the data of my first context. So pass that my first context as a first argument. Now, what this use context will do, whatever data we stored in this context, whatever data you have in this context, it will return that data. If it is returning that data, we can hold that data in one variable. So here simply I will say context data. Now this data we can bind here. That's it. We can bind here. Now if I go back here, now see here we got 100. In the E component, we got 100. So what I have done, first I have imported use context and my context in my child component. And then simply I have called that use context. And I have passed my context as a first argument because we can create any number of contexts in our application. You can create any number of contexts. So from which context you want the data, that context you have to pass as a first argument to the use context. That's it. So the first step is you have to create the context. So once context is created, then using this context, we can access provider component. So that provider component, we have to render in our parent component. So this is how we have to render. And this provider component takes one props, that is value props. The key name is value. To this value props, we have to pass our value, our data. We have to pass our data as a value. You can pass any type of data. Then we have to wrap our child component, direct child of a component inside the provider component. So we have to render our child component inside this provider component. Now, once you render, then only this context data will be available to B component, plus it will be available to direct child of B component, plus it will be available to indirect child of B component also. It will be available to indirect child of B component also. Now, any child component can access the data from context. How to access the data from the context? For that, we are taking the help of use context hook. So you have to import that use context from React library. You have to import your context from which you want the data, and just you have to call use context. And you have to pass your context as a first argument. Whatever data you have in the context, that data will be written. Remember, whatever data you store in the context, that data will be written. If you are storing number, number will be written. If you are storing one object will be written. If you are storing one array, then that array will be written. Okay? Understood this part, guys? Anyone, any doubts or any confusion in this? Just have a look on the first step. If you have any doubt in the first step, let me know. Is it clear for everyone? First step, creating the context.
The create context is a predefined one, right, sir?
Predefined function. So we are importing it from the React library. Just call it, context will be created. No need to do any kind of complex processes. No need to do any kind of configurations. Just we have to call it.
Okay.
Okay. Now, once context is created, using that context, using this context, we have to access provider component. We cannot access this provider component directly. So you have to say your context name dot provider. So where we have to render in the parent component. We have to render in the parent component. Yes, use context is one more hook. Any function name which starts with use word, all those functions are called hooks in React. Any function which starts with the word use are called hooks. Yes, from child to parent also we can transfer. But for that, we don't have like this direct way. We have to do little bit, we have to write little bit logic. So it's not two-way data binding, it's only one way, okay? Only parent to child you can pass. From child to parent, if you want to pass, then we have to write some logic for that. That's why it is recommended to use context only if you want to pass the data from parent to child. If you want to pass the data from child to parent, then context and props are not recommended. So we have some other technique for that. Okay, so this is the second step. Third step, make context available to all the child component. Then access the data from the context using use context hook. In your interviews, they will ask, what is use context hook? Can you explain me about use context hook? What is context API? What kind of problem context API is solving? Now, if you say props drilling problem is solved by context API, then they will ask, what is props drilling? What are the problems you are going to face with the props drilling? Can you please explain? This is what the people are going to ask you the questions in your interviews. Okay, suppose I want the data in C component also. In the C component also, I want the data. Let's assume that here in the C component, here I want the data. Here I want to show the data. So how to get the data here? What I need to do? I want the data in the C component also. What I need to do for that?
Import context API.
Yeah. So the first step is you have to import use a context hook. Okay. Don't say context API, say use a context hook. We have to import use the context hook. First step. Second step, import your context, whatever you have created. Import your context. Third step, inside the C component, call use context. Fourth step, pass the context from which you want the data as a first argument. That's it. Now it will return that data. So just hold that data in some variable. And this variable, you just bind with your element. Yes, excellent. That's it. Now see, inside C component also you will have the data.
This context.js file you created inside the folder, right? So can we access this context, my first context in other folders as well, right?
Anywhere you can access. You can
Yeah.
create anywhere, you can access anywhere. Okay.
Example counter folder or
Yes, you can access.
okay, we can the context.js file we can create
But
out.
you can access context, but you cannot access the data of the context in the counter. Why? Because now the context data will be available to only those components which are wrapped in the provider component. So your counter is not wrapped in the provider component, so you cannot access. So if you want to make context data available to counter component also, then you have to make sure that your counter component is wrapped inside the provider component.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So I will push this code, just practice up to here. Tomorrow again we will work on this context part. Okay. So tomorrow I will show you, I will tell you one use case where we will be using this context concept. So before you come to tomorrow's session, make sure you guys are practicing today's example, whatever I taught on the context API. And if you are getting any doubts, feel free to add your doubts on WhatsApp, or in tomorrow's session, you can ask your queries. But make sure you are able to implement context API by tomorrow. Okay, I will push the code right now. So within 5 minutes, you should be able to access this code. Yeah, guys, I have updated on the GitHub. You can just check it.